system but really, without the urinary system, you get into trouble pretty quickly. Because as we're going to see, when I say to you urinary system and kidneys, what do you think about? Urine, pee, exactly right. Yeah, urine, exactly right. So, yes, getting rid of waste products. But as we've kind of hinted at since way back in September when we first met, is that the kidneys are going to be doing a lot more than just that. There's a number of different processes that the kidneys are involved in, kind of like the liver, where, yes, the liver is involved in digestion, but it's got all of these other kind of important functions also. So you're going to see that also with the kidneys as well. Things like acid-base balance and fluid and electrolyte balance. Please don't tell me that we're going to talk about RAS again. Yeah, we're going to talk about RAS again. Why? Where's renin produced?
Kidneys.
In the kidneys. So the very first step of RAS begins with the kidneys, right? So again, our sodium reabsorption is happening in the kidneys. So all of these things that we've been talking about all the way along, it all kind of is related and links back to the kidneys. So very, very important system. We're going to take a look at starting with the general anatomy of the kidney, and then the blood supply. That's what we're going to take a look at today, the blood supply to the kidney. Then we're going to spend a bunch of time looking at the nephron, which, as we will see, is really kind of the functional component of the kidney itself, and is doing all of these different actions that are required for the kidneys to work properly. And then we're going to talk about the physiology of urine formation and the 3 steps that are involved: filtration, reabsorption, and secretion. And we're going to remind ourselves all the way back to last semester for fluid and electrolyte balance, and then all the way back to earlier this semester when we were talking about that Starling's law of the capillary, or fluid exchange across the capillary. We're going to see that this process is happening here in the nephron as well. And then briefly we'll talk about the rest of the components of the urinary system, the pathway to get urine to the outside of the body, and then wrap up by looking at the micturition reflex, or this process of urination. And as I said earlier today, it's going to look almost identical to the process of defecation in terms of the reflex components and then the voluntary components. All right, so let's take a look generally at the urinary system and the 4 major components that make up the urinary system. So we start, of course, with the kidney. This is where most of our focus is going to be for this unit, because that's really where things are happening. The other 3 components are essentially just a way to be able to get the urine to the outside of the body. We're not going to be changing the composition of the urine at this point. That all happens in the kidney. Now we're just trying to get the urine that is formed in the kidneys to the outside of the body, and that happens through the ureters. So there's one ureter that's connected to each kidney, and then we'll drain down to the bladder. The bladder is essentially just a bag that's going to be able to hold the urine until we have enough that it makes it worthwhile actually taking some time out of your day to go and void that bladder. Otherwise, you'd just be constantly producing little bits of urine all the time, and you'd be constantly just in the washroom. I really hope that you did wash your hands, for those of you that went to the washroom, because, you know, feces. And then finally, our last component of the urinary system is the tube that's going to connect the bladder, the storage bag, to the outside, which is the urethra itself. And so we'll talk a little bit about the urethra here, and then when we talk about the reproductive system, especially for the male reproductive system, we'll say a few more words about the urethra in that respect, because as it turns out, the urethra has a double purpose in men, whereas in women it has the single purpose of being able to drain urine to the outside. Okay, as I said, our overall kidney function is much more than just excretion of waste. So yes, that's on the list, and yes, it's important that we get rid of hydrogen ions, and we get rid of urea, and we get rid of creatinine and potassium, all these things that we don't need. That's very important. But as we've seen, look at all of the other things that the kidneys are going to be able to help regulate, right? All of these things that we've talked about before: ion concentration, osmotic volume, pressure, pH, so all of these different things that have kind of here and there, and oh, that's not in the kidneys, no, that's in the kidneys, no, that's not. Well, now we're in the kidneys, which means it's doing all of these similar things, including the production of hormones. Give me an example of a hormone or a growth factor that's produced by the kidneys.
Norepinephrine.
Has to do with the blood. ADH, I heard ADH somewhere. ADH works on the kidneys. That's produced in the pituitary gland. Right? Yeah, so that's going to be involved in that control of, has to do with red blood cells. EPO, remember our old friend EPO, that erythropoietin, that is going to be that growth factor, that hormone that stimulates the production of red blood cells. That's produced here in the kidneys. So again, linked to all of these different body systems. All right, so just keep that in mind, that it's more than just secreting waste. So let's talk now about the renal anatomy. So you can see the two kidneys here on either side. You can see those suprarenal glands that we talked about last semester, that we all know as the adrenal glands. Those are sitting right on top of the kidneys here. And you can see the very large diameter blood vessels that are going to be connecting these kidneys. As we're going to see, about 20% of our overall blood flow at any given moment is going to the kidneys. You see that same volume, about 20%, going to our brain. So if you're sending 20% of your blood volume to your brain at any given moment, and we know how arguably important the brain is, that then tells you how important the kidneys are also, given that there's that much blood going to your kidneys. So very, very important that we have a good blood supply moving in and out of the kidneys to allow for all of that functionality to take place. So here's a nice, happy, healthy kidney. You can see lots of adipose tissue associated with the kidney, and that's normal. We want to make sure that there's lots of fat tissue around there to help support it and help cushion the kidney so that it's not going to be injured. It is bean shaped, so again, we talk about a kidney bean. Yep, it looks very much like a kidney in terms of that shape, obviously a lot bigger than what a kidney bean is. But it is about big enough that it will fit, as you can see from that previous image, kind of in the palm of your hand there. So you can see those measurements. Only about up to 150 grams. So really not all that large, given how important it is in terms of regulating all of these other functions in the body and the amount of blood flow that's going to it. It's still a pretty small little organ here, but very important. We've seen this word hilum before. Where have we seen that? In the lungs and the lymph nodes. Yeah, exactly right. So in those lymph nodes, again, at this connection point with other systems. So we have our blood vessels are going to be entering and exiting here, as well as the ureter that we'll talk about a little bit later on is going to be exiting the kidney there, all in that kind of one area. When you look at the location of the kidney, kind of you have a sense for where the kidneys are found. If you had to kind of say, like, where are they? Where would you say they are? Yeah, exactly. That's what everybody does wrong. You all say, oh, the kidneys are here. They're kind of like right here. And they say, okay, well, they're kind of like right here. No, they're kind of like right here, like way around on the posterior side. And this is different from what a lot of people think. A lot of people think, well, they're kind of like flanked. It's kind of like on my side. They're not. They're on the posterior wall of the abdominal cavity, and actually quite a bit more superiorly located than we often imagine. Okay, so just to keep that in mind, where that location is, they're going to be partially protected by your rib cage, by the floating ribs. So that's how superiorly located they are, is that they're getting some protection from those floating ribs. Again, but on that posterior abdominal wall. They're held in place by that adipose tissue that we were talking about before. So all of that tissue there that's going to kind of keep it supported and keep it cushioned from any damage that might be happening. And as I said, partially protected by those floating ribs, as you can see right here. Now you'll notice this is an image that's showing kind of a blood supply to the kidneys, but it gives you the outline of the kidneys themselves. You can see that the left kidney is a little bit more superiorly located as compared to the right kidney. The right kidney is a little bit lower down, a little bit more inferior. Why is that? It's a real thing. It's not just like, oh, well, they just took the camera out. It looks great. Most of the time, we're going to see some pretty good symmetry from right to left side. Right? You don't have one of your lungs that is kind of much more superiorly located than the other. But why is it that we're going to see that our right kidney is a little bit more inferiorly located than our left? Yes? Okay, so maybe where the blood supplies are, not so much. The blood supply is going to kind of go wherever the organ is. Okay, the heart there and it's big. And so it takes up space. And so you have to make sure that there's space that's for that liver that's going to be in that same kind of region. And so that kind of like pushes that kidney a little bit more inferiorly. So again, for most people, you're going to see that that right kidney is a little bit more inferiorly located, just to give the liver the space that it needs. Again, partially protected by the floating ribs, but not fully protected, because again, they're a little bit too inferior to be fully protected by those ribs. And this is kind of sometimes helpful for us, but also sometimes problematic. Because what's the problem with our floating ribs? The nice thing about the floating ribs is that it makes us a little bit more flexible, so we can kind of bend side to side a little bit more easily. But what's the problem with the floating ribs? They can break more easily than other ribs. Why? Because they're not attached anteriorly to the sternum, right? So we don't have them attached anteriorly, they're only attached to the spinal column. And so that means they're a little bit more susceptible to damage. And if you were to fracture those floating ribs, you're playing a contact sport or whatever, and you get cross-checked in the kidneys, what can happen? You fracture that floating rib, and then where does it move? Right into the kidney, right? And so now you've stabbed yourself in your own kidney with your own rib. And so that's a problem, right? And so you have to make sure that when you're playing those contact sports, you're wearing the appropriate pads. Why do they have kidney pads? To stop that from happening, so that you don't bruise those kidneys or puncture the kidneys with your own broken floating rib. So thanks a lot, floating rib, sort of. As long as you keep it intact, it's usually not a problem for you. Let's take a look at the inside of the kidney. So when we open up the kidney and take a look inside, we'll see some actual images in just a second, but as with the textbook drawing, sometimes it's helpful to look at a stylized drawing before we see the real messiness of the actual body. But we have this organization of a solid organ, and oftentimes when we see and have solid organs, there's going to be an outer part and an inner part. And so we saw this when we were talking about some of our endocrine glands. We talked about this for the adrenal gland, for example. We had an outer component, a cortex, and then an inner component, that medulla. And we talked about the brain. We talked about the cortex of the brain being around the outside. And so we see the same thing here for the kidney, where the parenchyma, what's the parenchyma? The functional parts. So the parenchyma of our kidney is going to be organized into two regions. There's the cortex, which, as we learned with the brain, is this outer layer, this outer rind, if you want, around the outside, this layer-colored area. That's going to contain the nephrons. So the nephrons, as we're going to see, are the functional components of the kidney itself, and the major components of the nephron are going to be located in that cortex area. So there's the nephron you see. It's a little bit larger than what we will typically imagine, but they've drawn it there so you can kind of get a sense for where it's going to be located. But the major components, these first little components right here, that's going to be where most of the action is happening when it comes to our nephrons. Then we have the inner component of the parenchyma, which is the medulla. So the medulla is the central portion of the kidney that is not just drainage. So this is going to be this deeper layer that is made up of these, anywhere between 8 and 18 of these cone-shaped, what they call renal pyramids. And so you can see these kind of darker color, much more rich color of these renal pyramids, with the apex of the pyramid pointing towards the center of the kidney itself. And so there's going to be some drainage components that happen through these renal pyramids. There's quite a bit of variability from individual to individual, and it's not linked to your ability of kidney function. So it doesn't matter if you have 8 of these pyramids or if you have 18. Just because you have 17 doesn't mean you make better urine than people who have, 11. It just means that there's some variability. And so some people have fewer, some people have more, and there doesn't seem to be any real advantage or disadvantage to it. It's just how you were made. Okay? So we've got these different pyramids here. In this example, we've got kind of 6 of these renal pyramids, but you can imagine that in the full 3-dimensional shape, you would have more, all kind of arrayed around this central portion of the kidney, with the apex of each of those pyramids pointing towards that central portion. Okay, So when we look then at an actual kidney, so this is a bit of an older kidney, not preserved, but not super duper fresh, as it's been sectioned open. Again, you can see the cortex around the outside, so a bit of a lighter colored cortex around the outside, and then this deeper, richer color of those pyramids separated by the renal columns. And essentially the renal columns are just kind of extensions of the cortex that separate each of those pyramids. Now, if we zoom in a little bit closer onto a fresher example, we can see something like this. Okay, so fresher, you can see the blood is still here, and you can see again this very light colored cortex. That's where all those nephrons are going to be, and then these renal pyramids, again with the apex of the pyramid pointed towards the center of the kidney. There's that renal column that separates one pyramid from another. Now we're going to take a look at the drainage system. So the drainage system is part of that kind of non-functional area. So it's not creating the urine. All it's going to be doing is collecting up urine that was formed from the cortex and from the medulla. And so when we look at this kind of first portion, the smallest portion of the drainage system, we find that this is called the minor calyx. Okay, so minor calyces, if you want the plural, calyces is plural, calyx is the single. And so that's what's going to collect up all of the urine from all of these drainage tubes, as we'll see, they're called papillary ducts, all these drainage tubes from all of the nephrons that are in that region, that are kind of bounded by that renal pyramid. So at the apex of each of the pyramids is where you're going to have one of these minor calyces. So there's one minor calyx there that's collecting up all the urine from this region of the kidney, and there's a minor calyx there that collects up all the urine from this pyramid, and all the urine from this. So you get the idea that for each of the pyramids, we have a minor calyx, which means that it depends on how many minor calyces you have, depends on how many pyramids you have. Right? So because there's between 8 and 18 of the pyramids, you'll have between 8 and 18 of the minor calyces, one minor calyx for each pyramid, collecting up all of the urine from that specific region. Then you're going to have the merging together of the minor calyces into major calyces. So you're going to have, 2 or 3, maybe 4 major calyces, but you can imagine here that this major calyx collects up all of the urine from each of these 3 plus that one, so you've got kind of all of this urine collected up from a much larger area then of that kidney. And then the 2 or 3 major calyces drain into the renal pelvis. So the renal pelvis then is going to be collecting all of the urine from everywhere as the destination for all of the urine from everywhere in the kidney on its way then into the ureter. So the urine is then going to drain from this renal pelvis into the ureter. If you were to remove all of the minor calyces and the major calyces in this renal pelvis, pull out all of the adipose tissue, all this fat tissue that was in there, what would you be left with? You just went in there and ripped it all out, what would you be left with? A cavity. You'd be left with a space, because you've taken all of that tissue out. Well, that is what's called the renal sinus. Now the renal sinus, it's not labeled here because you can't actually see it. It's the space inside of which we find this renal pelvis, all these calyces, and all this adipose tissue. So you can imagine it as if you were to remove this whole drainage system out of the kidney, that space that you're left with, that open space that you're left with, that's what the renal sinus is. If we can't actually see the renal sinus here because all of those structures are actually present. All right, so this is going to be our drainage system that we're going to come back to later on after we understand how urine is formed. Then we're going to come back and look at how does the urine actually drain through all of these, then out to the bladder and to the outside of the body. Just to zoom in a little bit more closely once again, so you can see the minor calyx. So this is one minor calyx right here. It's going to be collecting up all of the urine from all of the nephrons in this region. There's another minor calyx here, collecting up all the urine from this area. Another minor calyx here. So this then is going to be what? That's our major calyx, because it's collecting up all of the blood from all of these regions. Okay, and then draining it towards the center, into that renal pelvis, and then off it goes down into the ureter and into the bladder itself. Then we can look at the blood supply to the kidney. This is one of the two kind of key ideas when it comes to understanding how urine is formed, is to understand the important blood vessels of the kidney, and very importantly, the nephrons. So we're going to mention what these other blood vessels are. We'll label them, but our focus is mostly going to be on the blood vessels associated with the nephron, because that's what's doing all of the work of the kidney itself. But just for kind of completeness, we have our renal artery that's going to be coming in, and then we can see that there's going to be a number of branches. Now notice what happens as these branches continue to branch and where they're going to be headed. So we go to our segmental arteries and then to our interlobar arteries. Those interlobar arteries are going to be in those renal columns, right? So the renal columns in between the individual pyramids. And then from there, they're going to branch to the arcuate, and from there to the interlobular. So what are you noticing about where the smaller branches are found? They're found around the periphery. So we start with the largest diameter blood vessels at the center, and then we kind of branch out. And the farther we get away from the center, the more we get towards the periphery of the kidney, the smaller those branches are getting. We're getting smaller and smaller and smaller, all the way out until we get to this afferent arteriole. Branching from the interlobular arteries are the afferent arteriole. What does afferent mean? Toward. Afferent means toward. So we've seen the afferent neurons. Right here, we have afferent arteriole. And so the afferent arteriole means we're going towards something. Well, it turns out that what we're going towards is going to be a component of the nephron. And so this is now how we're going to get that oxygenated blood supply to the nephron itself. So thinking about this idea then, that the larger diameter blood vessels are at the center, and then as we get more and more and more towards the periphery, we're getting smaller and smaller and smaller. That must mean then that the nephrons are all going to be located out along the periphery in that cortex, which matches what we said a few minutes ago, that is where those nephrons are going to be found, is out in that cortex, out in that peripheral region of the kidney. Now, if you were to have to imagine what this blood supply of the kidney actually looks like, if you were to sort of send some liquid plastic, we'll say, into all of these blood vessels of the kidney, let that plastic harden, and then dissolve away all of the kidney tissues, that you're just left with a model of those blood vessels, what would it look like? Based on what we're talking about here, these branches going out towards the periphery, what would you imagine it might look like? Well, good for you that I actually have a picture of that. Whoa, interesting. So notice a couple of things. First of all, what do these look like? Kidneys. They actually look like the kidney itself. It has the same shape of the kidney. It's got that kind of kidney bean shape associated with it. So the capillaries and the blood vessels that are supplying this tissue, you can remove all of the tissue except for the blood vessels, and it still kind of looks like the actual organ itself. That's how highly vascularized this structure is. The other thing that you can notice, of course, is that these larger diameter blood vessels are all at the center. And then by the time you get out to the periphery, that's where all of those smallest branches are. Like if you were to touch this, what would it feel like? It's like soft on the outside. All these tiny little blood vessels just on the outside, right? Okay, and that's where all of our nephrons are going to be. That's where all of the action is happening, is out in the cortex around the periphery of those organs. Okay. So the nephron then is the functional unit. And we can zoom in here right on this region. There's the cortex around the outside, and we're going to zoom in on the nephron. Now, again, as I said before, in this drawing, they've drawn the nephron larger than it actually is relative to the rest of the kidney, just so you can kind of see that it's there. But we're going to see that there are hundreds of thousands, up to 1 million nephrons in each kidney. So they're going to be much, much smaller than what's actually drawn here, but that's going to be what our focus is for most of the rest of this unit, is talking about this basic functional unit of the kidney. This is what's doing all of that regulation, this is what's doing all of that filtration, this is what's doing all of the reabsorption of the sodium, the reabsorption of the water, and regulating all those fluid values and electrolyte values and all of that. That's all happening here in the kidneys. And so we're going to see that there are three major functions in terms of urine formation that the nephron is able to do, which is to filter the blood, first of all. Then we're going to return useful substances. We're going to hold on to the useful things that we want to keep. We don't want to be putting things like glucose out into the urine or amino acids out into the urine. That's just a waste. We want to hold on to those. Those are helpful. We want to hold on to lots of water. And then we want to get rid of unneeded substances, so waste products, things like hydrogen ions, things like potassium ions, things like urea, uric acid, creatinine, all these waste products that we want to get rid of. Well, then the nephron is going to be able to put those out into the fluid that will eventually become our urine. So when we come back next week, we're going to pick up the story of the nephron and figure out, well, what is the nephron? How does it work? And how are we then going to be able to lead to urine formation and the regulation of all of these? Thanks for your attention today. Enjoy your class with Dr. Stewart, and we'll see you next